So welcome everyone. It is great to have you all here with us today. My name is Ana Elterman. Yeah. I'm a PhD student at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. Fredrick holds a Bachelor of Education Arts degree from Egerton University and a Master of Art degree in Applied Linguistics from Laikipia University. He is currently a PhD student and a part-time lecturer of linguistics and communication skills in Laikipia University. Fredrick is also a senior tutor of English language and literature at Ngaremara Secondary School in Isiolo, Cont, Kenya. His research interest lies in discourse analysis and media text with bias on crime and policy issues. His current PhD thesis is entitled High-Tech Hate in the Online Narratives of Violence in Kenya, a forensic linguistic approach to hate speech in Facebook and Twitter. This research endeavor is supervised by Professor Jacinta Ndambuki, Dr. Florence Mutoni, and Professor Simfrey Makoni. So the title of this talk of this afternoon is Have Speech on Words, a forensic discourse analysis of visual of violence in Facebook and Twitter during 2017 general elections, Kenya. So Fredrick, please, now it's with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the presentation is entitled Hate Speech, like you said. It's Speech Beyond Words, a forensic discourse analysis of visuals of violence in Facebook. Let's go straight to the background, kindly. Background. Yeah. So the background, this study is based on the background, the following background. First, there is a growing preference of multi-semiotic text as opposed to the single-mode text design in the contemporary multimodal era of social media. Facebook and Twitter provide editorial utilities that promote user creativity in the way they use social media to design texts. Therefore, visual modes are arguably gaining a more privileged role and greater potency as a meaning-making resource, especially in the communication of hot topics, hate topic, those sensitive topics, as people try to hide their meaning from some people or some section of the population. They find using these important aspect of communication. Now, Facebook and Twitter users in Kenya often capitalize on the existing limitations of the keyword-based hate speech monitors. These have no ability to detect hate speech images or any graphics. They tend to leverage digital images and graphics to construct polarized ideological groups that depict those who are not as what the targets of discrimination and hate generally. On top of that, Kenya lacks objective criterion for interpreting visual communication for possible hate speech, especially among the law enforcers or hate speech law enforcers. Next slide, please. Thank you. So based on this background, therefore, we state the problem as, despite being a proscribed misdemeanor, online hate speech in Kenya keeps incarnating to adopt a multimodal forms that circumvent online hate speech filters, thus evading the law. It becomes not only necessary, therefore, did we begin at the beginning? So current, yeah, it's that way, yeah. So the current study, therefore, sought to gain understanding of a critical issue or a critical problem in the society through a contextualized, interpretative, forensic-based, computer-mediated discourse analysis, CMDA, of selected visual posts and tweets to make evident how aggressive and repressive ideology finds expression and tools in Facebook and Twitter through creative use of visual rhetoric devices that are well beyond obvious detection by the law enforcers. Now, out of this problem, therefore, we state the following objectives. Yeah, objectives, please. Go back to objectives. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anna. The first objective of this study, therefore, is to interpret selected visual posts and tweets from Facebook and Twitter during 2017 general election in Kenya for possible hate speech. And the second objective is to investigate visual strategies used in the construction of online hate speech in Facebook and Twitter during 2017 general election in Kenya. Next. So the literature for this study is organized in various areas. The first bit of the literature continues to place the study within the discourse tradition, the discourse field generally, which is mainly defined as the use of language beyond words, or I was at the literature review and I said that literature was divided into three sections. Yeah. The first section is locating the study within the discourse tradition. Discourse as defined by Clark, who says that discourse includes other types of semiotic activities, such as visual images, for example, photographs, diagrams, and page layouts, and so on. Then we have Herring, who says species of technology are full of multiple semiotic ensembles from which participants deliberately choose those that suit them. The complexity of choices made is viewed as a discursive practice on its own, as this is meant to achieve a given discursive effect. The other literature explores the concept hate speech as understood globally, and then it zeroes in to Kenyan case. So far, the discussions going around globally, there is no clear borderline between hate speech and free speech. The two are often mistaken, but the effect of hate speech are always felt and continue affecting people. Various people have defined hate speech as repressed hostility, that is Lee 2002, manifested through discriminatory sentiments aimed at insulting, stigmatizing the perceived other by Brink 2001. Parek 2006 summarizes hate speech into three essential features that are key in this study. It involves, the first aspect is singling out an entity, which may be an individual entity or a group entity based on certain characteristics. The second step is ascribing certain highly undesirable constitutive characteristics or qualities to such entity. And thirdly, depicting the so identified entity as impossible to relate with, and therefore directing all forms of discrimination against it and seeking separation. After looking at scholars' views on hate speech, then I zero in on the Kenyan case as defined legally by the existing law. And the first one is Article 3(1) of the Constitution of Kenya, 2010, that outlines various freedoms. And among these freedoms is the freedom of expression. But in the same article, section 2, it goes on to clarify that the freedom of expression does not in any way extend to propagation of war, B, incitement to violence, C, hate speech and advocacy of hatred. So in the Kenyan case, the constitution is quite clear when when hate speech, when free speech crosses the border and can be identified as hate speech. In Kenya, we have an institution that has been set up to fight hate speech, and that is National Commission on Integration and Cohesion. And in their Act of 2006, they bring hate speech into perspective by defining it as hate speech, any use of threatening, abusive, insulting words, or communicative actions like displaying, publishing, or distributing written materials intended to stir up ethnic hatred. That is the legal conceptualization of hate speech in Kenya. Now, in relation to language, therefore, I cite Badisi 2012, who says, hate speech is a social misdemeanor primarily perpetrated through language. Hence, the significance of a linguistic analysis as a way of gaining understanding into how online hate is constructed, as well as the underlying issues. However, determining when the free speech trespasses the border into the hate speech still poses challenge to Kenyan government and especially the law enforcers, since this determination requires a comprehensive analysis of pragmatic intention and potential effect of such posts or tweets in their communicative contexts. Now, what is the role of this study in hate speech? The place of forensic linguistic analysis in hate speech. I cite Hodgson 2013, who asserts that analysis of social media postings can actually reveal whether they are truly hateful or not in relation to the existing law. Terence 2014 and Wafula 2016, on the other hand, argue that forensic language analysis involves a determination of meaning, which normally involves an objective analysis of key words, phrases, themes, and other aspects of language, such as slang and regional dialects. Out of this conceptualization, the gap is quite clear that the verbal, the visual communication is not in the picture. Yet, this visual communication has really become a very important aspect of communication in the current time and in the contemporary hate discourses. Despite becoming a privileged mode of expression, therefore, in the contemporary online discourses, visual communication as a standalone or as an integral part of larger language text has not been sufficiently acknowledged, especially in Kenya. So we apply the following theoretical frameworks. The study uses computer-mediated discourse analysis, CMDA, by Herring, 2004, and has later improved in 2007, to make online observations and interpretations of results showing how Kenya's social situational context and the medium factors of Facebook and Twitter shape Kenya's online hate speech discourse. As a toolkit of approaches that actually entertains other related and discourse-oriented frameworks, this theory is applied together with a few other frameworks. The first one being Kress and Van Leeuwen, 1996, as revised 2006, reading visual images. Here we look at the composition of meaning of the visual message as a whole. Then we look at Thompson's 1997 theory of ideology or modes of ideology that help us to interrogate what is it that the designer is doing ideologically by choosing those aspects of visual text that they employ. Methodology. The population of this study is Facebook and Twitter users in Kenya. The research uses a qualitative descriptive case study and uses purposive sample to get a sample of 10 hateful visuals observed and collected from Facebook and Twitter at the electioneering time, which was dominated by heated online debates ahead, during, and after 2017 general election in Kenya. So from there we have a discussion of the data results. And before I go into the discussion, I want to share a few visuals that we are analyzing. The first visual is visible. That is visual 1. Kindly share visual 1. There is visual 2. Oh, you're following, eh? Let's go back slightly to visual 1. That visual represents a arm. There is an arm there holding a little baby wearing the jungle uniform that is normally worn by the police in Kenya, the key law enforcers. That child is wearing a hat that is traditionally in the Kenyan context associated with a particular tribe in Kenya. And the child is held above a steaming volcanic kind of a mountain, which represents Mount Kenya in Kenya. In this case, the child represents a particular tribe and the mountain itself represents a particular section of Kenya, normally known as Mount Kenya region. The use of the police arm holding the kid atop the burning fire is instrumental in showing how the government of the day, that is particularly from the region depicted by the mountain, is causing harm to the region that is represented by the child, which is actually the region of the opposition leader in Kenya who had lost in this election. We have visual 2. The visual again is depicting a police officer trying to shoot a person whose hands are tied, and that person is indicated NASA. NASA was the opposition party in Kenya during the 2017 election, and therefore the person bound represents the NASA region. Because Kenya is divided into so many regions, particularly represented by the linguistic landscape, we have about 42 tribes, each represented by a language of its own. Then we have ants that are holding phones, taking photographs of what is happening. And the NASA person says, if my blood will bring justice to future generations, so let it be. I am ready to die for justice and equality for all. We have visual 3. Visual 3 is presented in a kind of a football match with the words that are written in English and Kiswahili, a mixture of the two, whose translation is, I read, Luos from tomorrow, be ready to die or survive. Again, Luos is a tribe in Kenya representing the people who supported the opposition, and they had lost the election which they had contested. And this day was a day for demonstration to oppose the election. And these are the posts that they were getting on that material day. Basically, these are some of the visuals that we looked at. In total, we have 10 of them, but in the interest of the time, I go to the discussion itself and the findings. The first finding is that the findings show that there was purposeful design of visuals, arguments, and the verbal language in enhancement of speech, hate speech rhetoric online. Visual designers particularly employed foregrounding techniques such as visual size, font types, color tones, and framing devices to do the following discursive actions: to draw and hold attention to the salient hateful elements in the visual. There was a systematic use of foregrounding elements that were meant to draw the user's attention or the reader's attention to what was considered to be salient or important parts of that photo. They were also meant to persuade viewers to follow given viewing paths in order to arrive at designers' intended hateful meaning. They were also used to depict represented objects as detached, aggressive, or threatening and non-cordial. According to Kress and Van Leeuwen, looking at a photo in what they call the grammar of the images, we are able to analyze the social distancing between the objects represented and whether they seek for relationship or they are not interested. So the analysis was basically around the relationship between the represented objects themselves within the visual, and on the other hand, the relationship between the represented visuals and the reader, who also becomes part of the text when reading. Another finding was that Facebook and Twitter graphics and icons such as GIF, face emoticons, and digital hand gestures were in some cases used to replace the verbal text in denoting various visual moods of aggression, describing various acts of violence, such as punching. There were instances where, for example, someone would write a verbal text instructing a person to hit another person, but instead of using the word hit, the person would just replace that word with a punch, held punch, ready to hit someone. There were instances where the text designer instructs someone to slash or to cut another person, but instead of using the word cut, the person replaces with a sign of cutting using a panga. All these are visual aspects that are getting into the contemporary hate speech, and that the systems we have in Kenya to flag out, isolate, and deal with hate speech cannot handle, because basically they are based on hate speech word identification based on pre-stored dictionaries of the possible hate terms. And in that case, they are absolutely unable to deal with this new kind of hate that now goes on and uninterrupted within the social media, particularly the Facebook and Twitter in Kenya. Conclusion. So we say in conclusion that despite recent anti-hate speech campaign and legislations in Kenya, narratives of violence still abound in Facebook and Twitter communication in form of target-directed aggressive, standalone or picture or multimodal messages that exceed the limits of free speech, thus constituting distinct forms of online hate speech speech in Kenya. On the next point, on conclusion, we say that specific visual strategies ranging from desecrated symbols of national unity, disfigured faces of human beings, broken and sometimes color-coded maps representing where particular groups of people are, and highly nuanced visual images or imagery were used to achieve various discursive ends as follows. One, to depersonalize and decharacterize the targets. To incite regional separation. We've heard of cases where the map of Kenya, for example, is painted in two different colors, reflecting exactly the way political parties patterns look like. And therefore the parts are separated, indicating that they cannot be together. We have, they also bring to salience the perceived negative identity issues while concealing any positive characteristics of the targets identified. Therefore, we have generally we have skewed positioning of individuals and groups as deserving targets of violence, and sometimes making direct or indirect appeals to the public or the readers online to act with prejudice against the objectified and clearly identified targets. And thank you for your audience, ladies and gentlemen. Anna?
Thanks, Fredrick. We just can't see you. Yes.
Let me.
Thanks a lot. And there are some comments here. Renata in Brazil, she just said that in Brazil we have been facing the same situation, and she totally understands what's going on there. And could you, there are some questions as well. How do people socially respond to these hate speeches?
Sorry?
Or how do people socially respond to these hate speeches? Or how does the judicial system respond to that?
Ideally, the police would get into action and arrest the perpetrators whenever they have a complainant, someone complaining of some hate speech online. Otherwise, without that complaint, it just goes on and the public continues consuming that throughout. This paper is presented as part of larger work that looked at hate speech generally. And we also studied respondents who also shared with us their views, their perception and the interpretation of various hateful texts. Therefore, the effects are quite clear because from the respondents' data, some people cannot express their identity freely online because they fear being identified, isolated, and stigmatized. Although we are looking at the election period, this time only acts as a catalyst because the hate speech that was eventually identified was not basically about just politics, because the social identities were, various social identities were used to divide people. For example, gender, political affiliations, and other social historical issues that lie deep in the history of Kenya, especially with groups of communities feeling left out in the development and their sentiments that they share about not being part of the government and wanting to separate from the government. Anna?
Okay, thanks. There is another question, Fredrick. What role do images play in language practices in Kenya? Is the visual culture in Kenya a strong culture?
Yes, especially with the era of social media. Okay, visual communication has been there since the time immemorial, but with the time, its use, its applicability has not been as pronounced as it is now. But with the improved connectivity and majority of Kenyans being online, which provides various utilities for editing, photoshopping, importing photos, and recontextualizing them in different situations to create new meanings. This is just on the rise presently, probably reflecting the growing visual literacy among the Kenyan users, the Kenyan readers. Unfortunately, this is not matched in effort to look for and fight hate speech online.
Okay, then there is a last question. How do these visuals, how do these images are mixed with verbal languages? Do they use local languages mixed with these images?
Yes, we have, okay, first of all, we have two types of visual communication that were identified in this study. There were visuals that we call stand-alone messages, a visual with a series of aspects that can be read and interpreted on their own without any verbal language in it. Secondly, we have what we call an integral message, a message that puts together the verbal language and the visual language together in a complementary manner, where one emphasizes the meaning of the other. And sometimes, because of the recent fight against hate speech, the government has scaled up fight against hate speech, and users are also learning to hide it, especially from the law enforcers. So you will find it common for users to write a message that is using many languages, and sometimes some part uses visuals. Like I said, somebody will use the punch to represent hitting or fighting somebody without actually using the actual word fight or cut or kill. So I think it's an integrated aspect, but still we have a standalone visuals that can be read using the Kress and Van Leeuwen framework to bring out clear meanings based on the three meta functions that they articulate.
Yes, Fredrick. And would you like to share some final words and remarks before we conclude your presentation? Do you have some hopes in relation to changes in the political field and in the political debate? What are your feelings in relation to that, Fredrick?
All right. This hate speech that we see online in Kenya is actually generated in the course of discussion of political matters. And from the discussion, and when we apply Thompson's modes of ideology, we identify underlying issues that people are trying to raise through this discourse. And therefore, politically, in Kenya, I think politics in Kenya and how they are played online is the key generator of the hate speech we are seeing. One, because Kenya is a multi-ethnic country, we have for two ethnic groups. Each of these ethnic groups is represented, have their own mother tongue. Actually, they are defined by their own mother tongue, and some of them have dialects therein. And again, these tribes have been, even the administrative boundaries sometimes are followed these tribes. So the tribalism is very high because again, in Kenya, politicians are, marshalling support around the communities they come from, and sometimes they form what we call a conglomerate of communities and ethnic groups to form the government. And it is far from ending because in Kenya again, the region that fronts the present day's president, that region is actually believed in the local discourses to be the government, thus excluding the rest that were probably in the opposition and all that. And so what is left now is communication between the government, the region that fronted the president, and the government. Those on the region that lost. And so there is that ongoing conversation about all that, and there are so extreme sentiments, and hate speech is actually embedded in these kind of discussions. So in my view, we still need to do much more. And that is why this research comes in to help the law enforcers regarding hate speech to get better ways of understanding the changing forms of hate speech online, because it is actually changing, but the method of dealing with it is not changing. It is just there as it was long time ago. Thank you. Yarda?
Thank you, Fredrick.